Thank you, songsters. I keep tearing up. I asked the captain if my farewell could be after I preach, because by golly, I'm going to make it through this message. Thank you, Robbie, for reading my scripture this morning. By the way, it's Robbie and LJ's birthday today. They share birthdays, so before you leave, make sure you say happy birthday. But these 5 verses at the end of chapter 4 in James is all about following God's will for our lives. And nothing else summarizes a true character of a believer than the desire to do the will of God. In Psalms chapter 40, verse 8, David wrote, "I desire to do your will, my God, your laws within my heart." And then again in chapter 143, verse 10, he says, "Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your good spirit lead me on level ground." And then again, Peter encourages Christians in 1 Peter, and he says, "Live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God." But the best example of one living out the will of God was Jesus Christ himself. He showed us an important ingredient of a relationship with God, and that was obedience to his will. Now, James approaches the topic of responding to God's message in these 5 verses, and he enforces a critical point. We all have hopes, dreams, and plans for our future, and the Bible never discourages us from looking toward the future with bright expectations. But however, we must make sure it is in line with God's will for our lives. We need to plan with an attitude of humility and submit to God's will. And as humans, naturally, we want to take over our own circumstances, but we have to submit to God's will and his authority. And when we submit, we need to submit with every intention and with every aspect of our lives, even when our plans get altered to fit his purposes and his plans and his will. So he may do with us whatever he wishes to fit his plan. So there are many passages in the Bible about following God's will, but James took an interesting approach. His approach was more of a hard one to take in. And in these specific verses, James chose to use the example that his readers would recognize. His readers, he was addressing traveling merchants, and many of them were businessmen, and they were successful in business, and he wanted to warn them about arrogance and the improper use of wealth and the danger in it. And nothing was wrong specifically with what they were doing, but what was wrong is what they were not doing. They were not including God in their plans, and they just had a total disregard for him. And in this section, James starts off with verse 13. "Now listen, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money.'" Now, right off the bat, there's just a complete lack of humility, and it's a total disregard of the Lord. It's like the parable told in Luke chapter 12. And in the Message, Luke chapter 12 reads, "The farm of a certain rich man produced a terrific crop. He talked to himself, 'What can I do? My barn isn't big enough for this harvest.' Then he says, 'Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll gather in all my grains and goods, and I'll say to myself, "Self, you've done well. You've got it made, and you can now retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life." Just then, God showed up, and he said, "You fool, tonight you die, and your barn full of goods, who gets it?" That's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God. And just before he told this parable, he said this, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." So this is what happens when you shut God out It allows sin, like greed, to creep in. And in verse 14, James gives us reasons to how foolish it is to leave God out. First, he says, "You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Just like the rich fool in the parable, don't be ignorant about the future." Proverbs 27:1 reads, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." And the reality is that life isn't simple. We have to realize that God is in charge of what's sad is that those who don't realize that miss out on so much, and they miss out on a relationship with God. And as believers, we have the comfort of knowing that God of the universe is in control of every event and every circumstance of our lives, and it's all weaved into his perfect plan. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Psalms 37:4. But it reads so much better in the Message. It says, keep company with God and get in on the best. And personally, I think that right there should be a bumper sticker. Keeping company with God and get in on the best. And then again in verse 14, James gives us a second reason why it is foolish to leave God out. He says, "You are a mist that appears for a little while, then vanishes." We're like fog in the sunlight. We're there and then suddenly we disappear. Our lives are literally like as quick as a blink of an eye. And the bottom line is to not include God in your life is pure foolishness. Skipping over to verse 16, "As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil." And upon my studying the book of James, I came across a word called self-theist. There's atheist and then there's self-theist. And I'd never heard it before, and I kept reading, and it makes sense to me. But what it means is that it's someone who refuses to submit to the uncertainness of life over to God. It's someone who sets their plans, their goals, and their wills above God's. Self-theists acknowledge God, but just simply choose to ignore him. So it's someone who values their plans above anything else, and nothing else matters except their plans. And in verse 17, it says, "If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." If we know God's will, we are responsible to obey it. That's it. If we don't, that's sin. We will never find comfort outside of his will. And if you think you've found comfort outside of his will, I can promise you it's only temporary and it won't last. But like I mentioned before, James took somewhat of a hard approach to the subject of following God's will. But amongst these 5 verses is planted in the middle a little nugget of truth. Verse 15, it says, "Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that." There is a blessing in acknowledging God's will for our lives. Acknowledging God, working through our lives, and truly obeying him is what characterizes and marks us as true believers. Our submission to God needs to become a habit for us, a continued process. And it doesn't end. In every circumstance and occasion in our lives, and how we act and what we say and what we should be thinking, it should be just like it says in verse 15, if the Lord wills it. He really needs to be the center of our plans and our lives. So what's the result? Immense peace. We can feel hopeful and confident that an amazing and astounding, powerful God is in our lives and in our world. And for us as believers, living out God's will for our lives is a true act of worship. It's supposed to come from the heart as a way of life, and recognizing that he will energize us and he will give us strength when we need it. In Romans 1:2, Paul reminds us to be living sacrifices. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and perfect and pleasing will. Responding to God's will at times can be scary, and it can be a test of our faith, but we must trust him for the future. And a strong desire to fully live out for God, it is a sure sign of a transformed life. I never would have dreamed that the journey that I'm about to embark on would be God's plan for my life. I'm going to make it through, I promise. But honestly, when I realized that I was called to be a Salvation Army officer, I was really scared. Like I had some fear to work through, and he knew that. So I think that he purposely set me here to help me work through that fear. And all the stories that I've heard in School of Understanding have definitely got me pumped for the rest of my life. But the last 2 years, everyone that came in to speak to us, pretty much all of you made the same comment. And that was that you only have one regret, and that's that you couldn't give another life to the Salvation Army, to be an officer again and do the work for his mission through the Army. And you know, I didn't listen to God right away when I was younger, and I really wish that I had, because I'll turn 31 this summer, and I really feel like my life is just beginning. And I just know that every step to get me to where I am today, every mistake I've made, you know, it's gotten to me to where I am today, and I'm just really grateful for the Lord's direction in my life. But as we come to a close, I wanted to sing through Have Thine Own Way, Lord, one more time. And the praise band is going to lead us in it. But I'm just wondering if there's someone here who's a little unsure about their future, or maybe you're currently waiting on an answer from him. You know, and maybe it's not the answer that you're looking for. Maybe he told you no. But we have to trust that his no is way better than our yes and what we think is better. So if you're in that time of waiting, I invite you to come forward and just fully surrender everything over to him. And just like in the song, he's the potter, we're the clay. Just ask him to mold you into his will and his plans. And if you really just have no idea, I promise you it's okay to be unsure, because I was unsure for like 10 years. You just have to fully surrender over to him and seek him with your whole heart and fully rely on him and follow his leading and just really listen for him.